Hi everybody, I'm John Medaglia. You will find me either here or across the street at Drexel University, and I kind of freewheel between psychology and neurology on both sides, but I'm primarily at Drexel now. I want to kind of bring us way up to about 30,000 feet and look down at this class of tools and concepts I'll refer to as network neuroscience. And really the question I want you to have in mind throughout these 20 minutes is, will network neuroscience solve the brain? So if you haven't kind of kept up on the trends in the literature, you're going to increasingly see lots of networks all the time. And I want to kind of give you a forward-looking but skeptical take on what we're doing with these techniques. So what's exciting about them in principle, where is the power, but then maybe where are the liabilities within that power and flexibility. So from the onset, when people started associating brains with minds, we kind of looked from the outside in all along. We kind of noticed the shape and the size of brains. We have plenty of imaging studies and evidence attesting to the use of looking at the shapes and size of brains. And once we had very famous cases, like who here in the room knows who this person is? Okay, good, so we're well informed of this. So Phineas Gage is where you start almost every kind of introductory lecture on this, and for good reason, in the sense that these were some of the frank cases of people paying attention to the link between function and anatomy. We moved on, and Brodmann came along and gave us some mapping of the cytoarchitectonic structure of the brains. There's some inference that the way different things are shaped at a low level might influence behavior at a high level. And it was many years later that we started doing functional MRI. Actually, around the same time, we were having the emergence of diffuse intensular imaging, which eventually evolved into the kinds of maps that you now see today, where you have anatomical projections being mapped within the brain at the individual level. And somewhere around maybe 2002, the first exposure of network science properly defined started to be applied to the human brain. And so I want to build a little bit of intuition today about what I mean by network science, which helps us understand what I mean by network neuroscience. So it's important to notice that networks connect us, so such as when we look at cell phone networks, they help transport us. People have done a lot of wonderful work understanding how our air traffic control can be optimized using networks. So as bad as your airport experience is, it's definitely better than it could be if we didn't have the tools from network science. So this is a really hard optimization problem. And indeed, we learned a lot about network science just by trying to get people where they need to go in big, complicated networks. Social science really adopted network techniques in the psychological sciences just to see how do different people of different types affiliate, what is that network shaped like, and how does your position in your connectivity space of other people influence your life. You can think of networks as creating us. So looking at gene-gene interactions in our DNA is ultimately what unfolds to help you interact with your environment and become you. And eventually, the story for today is that networks comprise us. We often tend to be cerebrocentric as network neuroscientists, so we kind of look at the brain, we're okay with the fact that we cut it off at the spine, and the rest of that is, you know, kind of this epiphenomenal thing. It's really important and one of the big challenges for the field, and there are many more studies all the time and have been for 100 years that we really need to think of the entire nervous system as our psychological basis. Nevertheless, I just want to kind of ground us in high-level brain science. So a network's kind of what you already intuit, but it's important to understand why what's really simple about networks is why we can understand what's complex about networks, and then say simple things about complex networks. So right here, as you can see, there are just maybe 3 little people here on the screen. We can draw links between them. Maybe these 2 are slightly closer friends than each of them to the other one. So you can see the idea of weights in relationships. You usually have things, which we'll call nodes. We have little connections, which we call edges, and then we can mean different things by that and weight them differently. Over here in our computer example, we might actually have an idea of direction, so something related temporally. We might want to make a causal claim about how this computer talks to that computer in some particular order. And then we can have different weights to those features. From those really simple rules about what we can represent anything that has things and connections between them. And that's what really facilitates us moving on to what's different about networks from anything else you might do without networks. So your neighbors in your network in part define what you are. And so you can sensibly see this without any particular context, where if I think about this little red node and I don't worry about any of the connections to its neighbors, maybe all I care about is that node. So this might be a psychological study of one. I'm looking at that person at that time. I don't necessarily care about how they relate to other people. And then I can kind of start to build it out. Well, maybe I want to know how much they talk to their friends nearby, to what degree and in what way. Maybe I care about how their friends talk to one another. Maybe I care about how those friends are organized in their own groups. And you can see sensible ideas just from the picture here, where if you knock this friend out of the network, maybe none of these people will ever communicate information to one another. So indeed, one of the challenges of our time is a lot of work showing that our social networks are increasingly separating and galvanizing against one another. This is behind a lot of socio-political trends where you might have your Republicans isolated from your Democrats, isolated from your independents, and if you don't have any friends helping them influence one another, they're going to continue to just affiliate with one another. And there have been some wonderful studies from many universities attesting to that. You can also think about networks in their entirety. And this is indeed one of the most compelling reasons to look at networks. So it's not just who I'm talking to and how they talk to each other, but this, as you can notice, starts to create its own structure. And that structure imposes order onto what happens within it. So for instance, you might have heard of this concept of small worldness. That means that it clusters into little groups, but it has a very short path length. So because these things are well connected to one another, you can kind of eyeball across this network. It's really easy for you to find a couple of hops to get almost anywhere in there. You don't have to go through a lot of transitions to get to other sides of the network. You can see that some networks are much more kind of having a core structure, and there might be people on the periphery. You can have things over here where there are lots of modules and then a few connectors in it. When you look at images this way, you can immediately understand things like robustness and dynamism. And so what I mean by that is if, again, you blow out a node right here, you suddenly don't have a system anymore, you have 4 systems. If you knock out a node in the middle of this, most of the things are still going to connect to one another. If you cut off something on the periphery, it's not going to matter so much for the central structure, and we're going to see how that matters for brains in a second. So of course, networks in nature come in many different kinds and degrees of networks. Here are, and I've deliberately stripped this of content, I just want you to appreciate that one of the things that I think attracts people to network science is an aesthetic property. People find these things beautiful to look at. And some of the beauty they're responding to is, I mean, look at this just wonderful swirly McGick. Right? You don't need to know what it is, but there's just, you can see an object here, there's kind of this heavy tail, there's a little friend network there. If you look at these things, you kind of start to want to ask questions immediately. So for network science, people get attracted to the properties implied by the pictures is one of the things that gets people into it. And then they start to think about, well, how can I use that to talk about the things I care about elsewhere? So there's an analogy in this. So you can see here these different colors are different groups, even though there's one big community. So maybe I can find subgroups within bigger things. And over here, you might notice that there are these little branches and branches and branches. So earlier, Joe was talking about these decision trees when you're conducting a study. You might have noticed that looks a lot like a network, and in fact, you can find these little branching structures in all kinds of networks. Fractals will have this. They have self-similarity at levels upon levels upon levels. Network science deals nicely with all of these concepts. So networks in the brain, really the promise here has been, we've always had this problem. We've known this for a long time in neuroscience of moving from molecular and submolecular levels through entire organs. Notice again, we cut off the spine and the peripheral nervous system. But we have to have some way of navigating within and between the levels. So I want you to think about the exemplars I'll use today from the high level of organization, really kind of can move across this. So anytime you can see a thing and kind of think of its parts and connections, there you have a network problem. And if it's a nervous system, you have a network neuroscience problem. So let's say we jam it into really this kind of cortical subcortical structure. I want to kind of show you that there really is something different about what happens with networks in a conceptual sense than anything else that happens without networks. What I mean by that is you can navigate across space. We're all familiar with navigating in space in our daily lives and in the brain. Things can change over time at different time scales. What you don't have without a network is this idea of topology. The relationships among things being as important as how they move in space and time. In other words, there's more dimensionality to the organ by virtue of the fact that you represent it as a network. And that's going to be essential to what I tell you today. Your brain is a special kind of network. What do I mean by special? What I mean by special is that there could be a lot of things that your network is. So a lot of what happens in network science is saying, what would happen if I took the same pieces that are in your brain and put them together at random? Would they look or work the same way? Does it look and work like something else? Is it good at this thing and bad at the other? Does it break more easily than this other thing? Your brains are kind of in the sweet spot for a lot of these things. So over many, many evolutionary cycles in human and non-human animals, we've ended up in this sort of sweet spot. I've just picked kind of 3 things from an influential paper here. You might have a diversity in how many things regions of the brain are connected to, which is a good thing because if everything's equally connected to everything else, it might not have any sparsity in how it processes information around it. You might have differences in order. If it's completely ordered, there's very little flexibility in that. So I kind of want to have a template, and then I want to work around the edges of that. I want a little bit of noise in that helps it to be flexible and change in response to things like learning. And I might have some sense of hierarchy. I don't need everything to be doing everything all at once. That's not only inefficient, but usually doesn't work in a system this complicated. I need to kind of be able to parse it to different levels to different degrees. And then unsurprisingly, by all of those pieces of language I shared, your brain's, again, kind of in the middle. It's got a little bit of each of these things. It's kind of on the balance between the two. It allows it to be flexible, fast, efficient, and adapt to its environment. Hubs is a term that you'll take with you in a lot of the literature as you read through it. This means a lot of things. I'll kind of just give you a sense for what it usually means in most of these papers. As you can visually distinguish, you might pick out modules or clusters on this map, each color being a different cluster. Community is often a word you'll encounter. And really that's as simple as it looks. These things are more connected to one another than they are to the other things in this little graph. And so I can do that and define these communities. If you wanted to squint more, you could find communities within communities. That's hierarchy. But you'll also notice that you can find special positions on this graph. And by special, I mean I'm helping things communicate with things that couldn't otherwise communicate. So when people talk about connector hubs, they're usually talking about, well, I help different bigger organizations talk to one another. Okay, these are mediators. These are people moving back and forth between communities, helping them talk. These are the people, when you have Democrats and Republicans, you hope you have a lot of them to help work together. Over here, these are the team leaders. These are the ones kind of sitting in the middle of it. They're communicating amongst all of the things within that group. You can kind of indirectly get to other groups, but you usually have some sort of broker in between. So I'm using this personalized language because this came from social networks first and foremost. People are making this analogy, they're understanding hierarchy, these transactional relationships. It's like, great, now I can describe these things, but with mathematics under it. Once I have the mathematics, I can do statistics, I can predict things. Excellent. So this gets us off the ground. The other dimension you're going to encounter is dynamics. And so networks are constantly changing, but to different degrees in different ways. And so taking that same analogy from earlier, we might again have 3 different communities, different connections. Colors mean different groups, and there are different edges. There are certain types of hubs. But you might be measuring over time, and generically you could start to see that not only will the particular edges and configurations change, the strengths and the distances of things, but you might actually lose the idea of separate things eventually. So as you're familiar with brains growing up from birth, they're going to be putting out lots of connections and pruning them and reconfiguring. There's a sort of, again, a general template, but then there are variations around this theme. So what is the theme that the brain ends up on at a high level of organization that is used for many different things? There aren't a ton of things that we can say that are generalizable from network neuroscience, but there are a couple that really help get us halfway there. So one thing that seems to come out is that the most dynamic networks are also coincident as hub networks. They sit at the middle of a lot of things, and they move around a lot between things. So if I'm going to change when I'm moving around during different tasks, there's one network that's gotten a lot of fanfare. I'm going to call your attention to this big frontoparietal network. Famously, in a lot of different clinical syndromes, this is the thing that might break first. If it's not directly affected, it's indirectly affected. It's associated with your inability to switch your attention, inhibit things you don't want to say, reason conceptually about abstract things. And interestingly, Cole and colleagues some years ago now showed that if I just kind of ask somebody to do all kinds of different tasks, I have the same person switching from thing to thing to thing while we're doing an fMRI scan, it turns out that not only is this network recruited a lot, this network changes its connectivity with everything else a lot. And indeed, people have gone to show, if I go in and then give people a stroke in this region or something that's kind of right on the edge, these kind of connector hubs between the communities, the entire system becomes dysfunctional. So you can think of things being isolated within systems and breaking down and affecting discrete sets of functions. You can also think about things on the boundaries between these, breaking pairs of functions. And then you can think about major systems like the frontal parietal network breaking down, ruining lots of functions. And so literally the system can't connect the way it needs to do all kinds of different tasks. So for me as a network scientist, one of the things you're looking for, it's not just can I describe the structures, it's can I describe something I couldn't before, predict something I couldn't before, and now tell you about the mechanics of how it works in a way I couldn't before. So that leads us to the idea of, all right, well, that promise, that question I led with is, can we get something like a complete view of cognition? And I think that this is what calls a lot of people to think of themselves as a network scientist. As you see that these tools can be used everywhere and navigate between these levels and these concepts, it's really, really compelling to use them as a theory. So it pulls for, there's a network science theory. I can describe the mathematics of how these things emerge and how they move, how they change over time. Maybe that's going to help us solve this problem. So I think that I'm just going to give you a little intuition for probably where we are. So this problem hasn't gone away. We still have anatomy in the brain. There's still plenty of wonderful work just trying to understand that. Believe it or not, we still don't know everything about the anatomy of the brain. It's been over 100 years, but we're still working on it. You can zoom in on these pieces and study it at various scales, but you can also notice that there's heterogeneity in what gets computed across the brain. If you think about this at differences in scale, you'll notice that this is consistent with applying network analysis. So you can do two things at once. You can say, within each level of organization, I can be interested in how things are connected to one another. I can also be interested in how things at this level of organization cellularly are grouped together in bigger communities to bridge computations. And so one of the nice themes of research from some groups is, well, I've kind of taken something up here in this more dorsal parietal region. Maybe similar kinds of computations are recruited together into different bigger components. And so this helps us kind of navigate our way through this combinatorial problem. I could be thinking about every single piece is important and different, or I could be conceptually testing the idea that is there some self-similarity in computation recruited into different systems? And if we're doing good behavioral and cognitive work, I might have a good guess about, well, here's a distinction between the two. You want to pair those two together. It turns out that there's a lot of really good recent work showing that if I just kind of look at what's passively correlated, so I do some fMRI, the person's again sitting in the scanner for a while, they're going to come out with certain prototypic networks like you saw on the previous slide. They're going to kind of group together. Turns out everybody's is a little bit different, but you can look around and see similar objects across people organized in different ways. So I don't have time to get into that, but for instance, with Dr. Hamilton's work, even just knowing where you aim the stuff has a lot to do with how these are grouped up in this particular brain. But if I look in that particular brain, ask how these things are connected up, the things that activate together during different tasks, the way that their patterns shape, are to a large extent shaped by how they're communicating most of the time anyway. And so if we can play that game, we can actually push it down another level, which is often not talked about, which again, way back in the beginning, I mentioned this image here where we have these nice diffusion tensor and related techniques where we can pull out the anatomy and connections. But anytime you have something talking in the brain, there had to be some physical way for that communication to occur. So through long-distance electrochemical communication, presumably we're transmitting messages across pathways that are physically embedded in the brain. It's important to know that these technologies have some really frank limitations to their accuracy to date. But the idea here is, can we get estimates that are better than nothing at predicting both the way the brain works and how it's related to behavior? And the good news is that when you start to pair these things together, we can ask about the relationships to cognition and behavior. We can parse out which systems are recruited for what, how the anatomy supports and separates those systems. And then the question I would say is that we've kicked most of this as a can down the road, where I don't know that I have an example where I can say convincingly just importing the network science technique has solved the cognitive problem. Often it's helped us better describe the problem in the systems. It might help us predict the behavior better than I could have otherwise. But I'm not sure I've gotten anything close to, this is the map it would take to rebuild this car and then predict where it would go. So our language, our way of kind of taking that ontology of what minds are and how they work in the brain, I would say has a more sort of florid descriptive language, has wonderful mathematical tools, but we still have to be good cognitive neuroscientists about the behaviors we care about and measure and apply. So I think this is the sort of, like any emerging science, there's a lot of flashy breadth. The pictures look fantastic. You have to bring your cognitive and critical faculties to that. And I think you need to talk to a good cognitive neuroscientist if you care about cognition in network science. So just a couple words here about, it's really important then to notice, if you haven't intuited it, that you can navigate from brain networks to different scales. So there's nothing illegal about that in the network sense. So I could look down in that brain, I can notice there are other brains around me, I can look at how those brains are connected to me and to one another as a much larger macro community of brains. And indeed, I can come and say, all right, well, maybe I'm somebody that I don't really like grouping up with people. I might be the kind of person that really likes one-on-one interactions with people of different kinds. And maybe my brain is structurally and functionally organized in a somewhat different way by virtue of that process. It might change how I relate to other people, and how I relate to those people might change my brain. And maybe there's some other peoples that kind of have these scattered networks, and then there might be other people that like to connect to other people who are really well connected. So you think of these as maybe your movers and shakers. They're just kind of up there, they're very visible, and they're moving around. There's something different about them, and it changes something about their brain. I can't get out of any general talk without talking a little bit about mind control. People fight with me 30% of the time, so decide in advance what you want to fight me about, see what I have to say, and then come talk to me over dinner. So all I mean by this term is, it actually sort of bothers me as a scientist that there's a word like this floating out there for which we have no actual scientific conversation. So really, I kind of turn into this skid by saying, if you were going to have a science of mind control, what would that be? Okay? I'm not actually talking that much differently about the things than you might think you would do. So I'm caring about how, when I interact through my senses, what that does to my brain and changes my behavior. I think about when I interact with smartphones and social media and friend networks, how that's sort of navigating me around. And then importantly, as Dr. Hamilton was intimating, we have a lot of ways of non-invasively and invasively going into the brain and changing it at different levels of scale. So the mind control problem is, I basically am thinking about that brain as some kind of system. I'm putting inputs into it in all kinds of ways, and I'm just expecting outputs out. So as the engineer approaches this, it's as simple as that. It's a system optimization problem from their perspective, and the inputs are kind of interesting details from that perspective. But when you start thinking about this, you have some desired behavior and a desired cognition. So for me and people like Dr. Hamilton, I'm really doing what I hope is the best thing for a patient, for instance. Or if I'm thinking about trying to build a technology to optimize somebody, I really want to know what I'm optimizing, what the trade-offs are, where are the liabilities, what does that mean to equitably or inequitably give it to people. But it usually looks something like this, and you could swap in any one of those symbols from before, and maybe let's say you want to change that behavior and cognition, and that's your goal. Well, most of what happens in the literature is the idea that I did my experiment, maybe somebody, I talked to my PhD advisor, he said, do it at 1.5 milliamps. And you ask why, he said, I don't know, it's because that's how they did it before, and the review process is going to be really hard, and it's too hard to think about, we don't know, try it out. It shouldn't be shocking that maybe at best you do nothing, and then sometimes you do worse, right? Because this is a finely tuned organism, and you can kind of nudge things around, and it's often going to go in the direction you don't want. So when people in engineering think about what's called a closed-loop control scheme, they're taking things like the output from that behavior and cognition, and they may be reading out brain states, and then they're basically just doing some sophisticated calculation, what the difference between what I want and what I have is, and then we're going to change what we do with this to hopefully start nudging these things into the positive direction. If you're a control theorist about this, the thing you should notice about this, because it applies to any system, is anytime you're doing this to something like this, and I've deliberately taken the network out of it, now just drop a network back into that, anytime you push one thing around, you should expect some opponent or opposite or nonlinear reaction elsewhere. So for the field at large, we don't have really a science incentivizing trade-offs. I want to build a treatment that works so I can make that money. I'm not going to go scrounging around for all these dynamic interactions are. So part of the responsibility in construing it as mind control is to say, I really am trying to control something about this. I might expect the effects to be weak. They might be bad, but they also might be a lot of things I'm not measuring. And so as you optimize this as an engineering tool, it helps you to think about, I just have to find good approaches to measuring that and anticipating in advance, which is sort of at the frontier edge as we build techniques like this. So in my last example here, kind of the scheme generically looks like you have something like that. You might be taking your network measurements here. You want to sort of, in one view, start with the anatomy. If I don't know how it's kind of physically communicating, it's hard to estimate how it's functionally communicating. I can zoom in across scales. And then the network story is wonderful because it turns out, as many others have now become keen to and are working on, you can apply energy into that system in a lot of sophisticated mathematical ways to predict, based on how this is physically wired up and how it functionally relates, where I expect that to go in different states. So I can look at several regions, I can look at the entire system. It's a hard problem to optimize, but we can try it out, and there are a lot of mathematical tools for that. And so the kind of frontiers in this is thinking about, well, maybe I'm interested in how people represent symbols visually. Like maybe I care about reinstantiating their visual function. Maybe I present them with something like a bicycle stimulus, but something's misfiring, they see something more like a wine glass. You can pick your favorite example here. The problem would be, well, take some information, you abstract that model away, you have some mathematical tools to estimate how you might inject energy into that, to drive it from state 0 to some other state. That maybe makes it more likely that I'm going to be perceiving something like a bicycle in the end. So the good news is people are hopefully trying to do this in the right direction. And the second piece of good news is most of this doesn't work, so it's more like a mind nudge. So I think that one issue that I've started to worry about very seriously, as I know has Anna Wexler here and others in this room, are there are penetrating communities around us. We know very little about how the public in general reacts to these things, as people funding the work and kind of being a broader part of this community and doing it themselves. We also don't really know, even as acting neuroscientists, most of the trade-offs in what we're doing, right? So as things begin slowly to get more potent, I think we really want to be careful about thinking about these balances. All right, so with that, I think I'm past time, so I'm going to call it quits. Thanks for your attention.